thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I also just wanted to take a moment to thank David Price, Joe Jennings, and Laura Brosh, along with the rest of the terrific staff at the museum for putting this together. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you. And I also have the great honor this evening to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Dale Smith. I had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Smith, I think more than 10 years ago now, at an international conference in England. I was actually slightly terrified when I saw that he was going to be there, because not only was I a great admirer of his scholarship, I knew him as one of the most prominent leaders in our field. But our shared interest in military and Civil War medicine has actually led to some of the best conversations I've ever had on the subject. But most significantly for me, meeting Dr. Smith has been a wonderful moment in my own life and career, because he has since become an invaluable mentor and now a treasured friend. Dr. Smith is a professor of military medicine and history in the Department of Military and Emergency Medicine at the F. Edward Hebert School of Medicine at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. From 2006 until 2013, he served as the Senior Vice President of USU. He received his PhD in the history of medicine in 1979 from the University of Minnesota under the direction of Professor Leonard G. Wilson. From that time until he moved to the Uniformed Services University in 1982, he was on the faculty of the University of Minnesota. He is the author of numerous well-received papers and books on medical history. And along the way, he has changed the way historians understand and study the history of medical education, the history of infectious diseases, the history of surgery, and the problems of patient evacuation in military operations. In short, his scholarship has demanded that those working in the field be better. While far too many to name here, it is worth noting his critical edition of William Budd's essay on the causes of fever, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press, which transformed the ways in which scholars understood disease in the 19th century. He has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Lawrence D. Redway Award for Excellence in Medical Writing, and he has been honored with the USU University Medal for his commitment to the academic life of the university. But he would probably say he is most proud of being named the Outstanding Civilian Educator in 2005 by his medical students. Indeed, I think what makes Dr. Smith so uniquely qualified to give this evening's keynote is his passion for medical education, which is very much in the tradition of William Hammond and Jonathan Letterman and the many others that have recognized not only the impact a conflict might have on the members of a practicing community, but the necessity of learning from that history. Dr. Smith has long embraced the idea that while history has several purposes in a medical center, it is mostly about professionalism. A physician is going to practice for about 40 years, and as Dr. Smith always notes, the challenge is how do we ensure that the students keep up with the changing science and the standards of practice? While most schools worry relatively little about helping students understand the dynamic nature of their profession and society responsibilities, USU, under the direction of Dr. Smith, has a systematic curricular emphasis in this area, and history is a vital part of that emphasis. Dr. Smith has thus published widely on the importance of medical history in medical school curricula and beyond, and following his lead, many medical schools, including my own, now recognize and teach that the social forces and ways of social decision-making is something that history of medicine does for professionalism and education in medical schools and beyond. Always conscious of the future of military medicine and a champion and encouraging of innovations, I think Dr. Smith summed it up best when he said, and I quote, "Watching the development of dual professionalism in young people dedicated to public service even with the unlimited liability that accompanies military service, is a joy and a privilege. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Dale Smith.
I'm going to have to look in the mirror and find out who's been talking to somebody, because I don't recognize that person. When David called and said, "Will you do this?" I actually had no choice but to say yes. For more than a decade, museum staff have, in the heat of the summer, in the spring rains, joined USA students and faculty on the Antietam battlefield to tell the story of Jonathan Letterman. And I want to try and share with you tonight why that dynamic relationship remains a critical part of the education of those who are going to take care of the sons and daughters of America who go into harm's way. If you go down to Arlington, you can, on Doctor's Row, find a white piece of rock that says Jonathan Letterman. And then it says, he brought order and efficiency in the medical service, and who was the originator of modern methods of medical organization in armies. Most of you know the story. Over 18 months, in the middle of a war, this doctor undertook a system of medical command and control, picking up the wounded at the point of injury, carrying them to a place where they could be cared for in order of need, and then further evacuating them to more definitive care. He put together a system of what we call push logistics to make sure the resources necessary for that care were at the point where they were needed, when they were needed, and we're not cluttering up the movements of the forces in the meantime. And he installed an after-action review to follow up on the care of those patients so that things could be improved upon. And in his own words, he did this not out of compassion, not out of humanitarianism, although that was evident in the field. He did it because he said the job of the medical officer is to strengthen the hand of the commanding general. I have, for more years than I like to think about, been trying to teach young people that military medicine is the application of medical art and science in a military setting for the benefit of the military to assist it in meeting its mission. That's why they dress up funny to go to work. The doctors could wear green scrubs, but they wouldn't be military medical officers. So how did it happen? You know the story. Lincoln was elected and 7 states said, this is going to be bad. And they met and said, we'll call it a new country. We inaugurated presidents in March then, because, well, people were sensible and took a long time to come to Washington. This business of showing up in January is, a new thing. And after March came April. The new president decided the old president was not doing his job and set out to resupply Fort Sumter. The people of Charleston objected, and we were at war. He called for 75,000 troops, not because his advisors told him it was going to be a short war. This is one of those myths that goes along in textbooks. Everybody knew this was going to be a long war who knew anything about war. He called for 75,000 short-term advisors because that's all the Militia Act of 1797 let him call for, and until the Congress gave him authority to ask for people to serve longer, he had to do that. And in a three-pronged push, they began to push south to put down this rebellion. And rather than send volunteers, 4 more states joined the Confederacy. And quite frankly, they didn't do very well in most of the efforts they undertook. Only a retired graduate from West Point who was busy running railroads and had come back into the service in the National Guard of Ohio, a man named George McClellan, moved into that piece of Virginia that didn't want to be part of a slave secession, West Virginia, and he met an untried general officer named Robert Lee and beat him at Cheat Mountain. And Lee went back to Richmond, and West Virginia became a state. Our hero was out in California, working with soldiers, trying to work with Native Americans who were objecting to new policies. He would come to the war, but the war was already going. Now, it's important to recognize that when he comes to this war, he's not coming in isolation with no new ideas. That great commentator on society, Robert Heinlein, in his Door into Summer, has his protagonist say, "When railroad timing comes, you can railroad, but not before." In 1860, it was for military medicine, railroad time. The time had come for a transformation. In April, when Fort Sumter was fired upon, the women of New York formed a relief committee. And because they were women, they organized it systematically. They began to supply the needs of men who would live in the field. They worried about things like sanitation and food, and the things that men can't be trusted to do on their own. Absent good supervision, they of course revert to type, which is barbarian. Their husbands, concerned that these women were getting beyond what they could appropriately do, volunteered to take over the organization and run it efficiently. It was never quite the same again. But they were bankers and lawyers, and they renamed it, and Congress agreed. It's called the United States Sanitary Commission when the men get through with it. Why did they do this? Because they had been reading the newspapers for the last 10 years, and they'd heard about this place called Crimea, where the British had done a really lousy job of taking care of their soldiers. And where the first time in history, an reporter was embedded, and you read in the London Times the next morning the screw-up of the day before by the Army Medical Department. And if Army Medical Departments do that, then we need to help them. And so they wanted to help them. Army officers had at West Point for 40 years been being taught that it was their job to take care of their troops. It was part of the first regulations done right after the Revolution, that this was part of a job. In fact, one of those teachers, Governor Warren, was there, and he would later fight with Letterman, and even in his fight he wrote, "Responsible as I am for the safety and success of the command in which I am entrusted." He knew it was his job. One of those graduates was wearing butternut. He's known by his nickname, Stonewall. And in General Order 26 of the Army of Northern Virginia's 2nd Corps, ample details will be made for taking care of the wounded. It was their job. And Major General McClellan knew that as well. As a captain, he had been part of the Delafield Commission to go over on the part of the Army and look at the disasters in Crimea. And another graduate who was Secretary of War at the time the Delafield Commission went and was now hanging out in Richmond, a man named Jefferson Davis, had charged them, look and report on the kind of ambulances and other means of transporting the sick and wounded. And they'd done so. So in the Army of the Potomac, when he inherited it, after McDowell had this small problem near Bull Run, he put together a commission of officers to study the disease threat, particularly typhus, which turned out not to be much of a disease threat, but he knew the peninsula was going to be dangerous. In that same period, civilian surgeons are worried about this. In the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, the predecessor to the New England Journal of Medicine, T.H. Squire wrote an article saying you need to have a robust medical capacity as part of the headquarters that will spread out through the corps to bring people back and supply the needs of the people. It was a very theoretical piece. Nobody paid any attention because, after all, it was in the medical press. H.H. Smith, teacher at Penn, wandered down to Washington to talk to the Surgeon General Finley to tell him, we need to take the lessons of Crimea and find a way to employ them in our wars. And early in '62, Brenton at Fort Donelson and Irwin at Shiloh put together tent hospitals on the field. You see, people knew there was an issue. It wasn't that there weren't any ideas. But Jonathan Letterman would do something with those ideas. We go out to Antietam because that's where this son of a practitioner who had joined the Army by taking a test to prove he knew something. Only doctors in America before the Civil War who had to take a test to prove they knew anything were those that joined the Army. He took it with a man named William Hammond in '49 up in New York. Now you'd think as classmates they would know each other. In the modern military we see each other, we PCS a lot, we know our peers. That was not true on the outpost army of antebellum America. They met, they would meet again, but their tracks didn't cross much in the next decade. In fact, in '57, Hammond left the military to teach. He'd come back. And Letterman came east. He was ordered to the purveyor's office at the end of '61 up in New York, where you buy medical stuff and you shove it out through the quartermaster corps to the people that need it. Because, well, even then, quartermasters knew that buying medical stuff was a peculiar and bizarre thing, and they wanted nothing to do with it. You know, the docs believe that if we say we need so much stuff, medicine, blood, we actually need that much stuff. A quartermaster has learned that a general will always tell you he needs 3 times as much as he really needs. And so 60% fill for normal Army logistics is deemed adequate. In fact, it's supernumerary. But in medical logistics, they really need better than 90% of what they ask for because, well, they know it's got a shelf life, and it's just a long tradition of knowing what you need to do and not being too greedy. This experience didn't last long. The problem wasn't in the buying the stuff. And as a regular officer, he's shownly detailed out to West Virginia, where he'll serve for a couple of months. Hammond shows up as his purveyor and medical inspector, as junior, although they're pretty close to peers, but because of Hammond's break in service, he's a little junior. They're both essentially 03s. And then in April, Hammond is promoted to BG. 03 to 07 is an unusual grade step in the Army. But there was political influence, and there was a huge problem. He asked Letterman to come along. Now we will not let a junior work for somebody that was their peer and is promoted over them because, well, they wouldn't act right. The failures at Bull Run, the failures of medicine, the failures of the first year led McClellan to a new strategy to go into the peninsula. The invasion was going remarkably poorly. The medicine even worse. And in July of 1862, Letterman was charged by Hammond to leave OTSG and go down to try and straighten it out. This is Hammond's order. Satisfy yourself that medical supplies are in proper quantity, and the time is past when the excuse "no supplies" will be accepted. You will tell the quartermaster your necessities in regard to transportation. You will require all medical officers to be faithful and attentive in the discharge of their duties. It was obviously some sort of problem. You will hire such physicians, nurses, etc., as may be required. You are authorized to call directly upon the medical purveyors who will furnish everything you ask for, regardless of supply tables or forms. The Army not only is promoting captains to general, but it's willing to abandon forms. You know this war is not going well. And he concluded, and now I commit to you the health, the comfort, the lives of thousands of our fellow soldiers who are fighting for the maintenance of our liberties. Our fellow soldiers. You see, there was something different about the medical corps in the United States Army that had to do with being part of the United States Army. We didn't have an aristocratic tradition. Our officers were not medieval dukes and the sons of dukes and the people with bar sinisters across their shields who had become, well, it was an organization I talked to several years ago, had thousands of members, the illegitimate children of Charlemagne. Europe had some issues with who was an officer, who was honorable. We had no such issues. And so the Army Medical Department asked and got from Congress the authority to be commissioned officers. So that Letterman, when promoted to go to the Army of the Potomac, became a major. Now he's called a surgeon because that's what they'd always been, but he's paid as a major. He's got the epaulets of a major, and he can give an order that's a legal order. And he says, given this unique job of being an officer, I'm going to ask my general for something nobody's ever asked for before. You see, some people like Larrey, who was a surgeon major in France. Major is a warrant. Comes from sergeant major in France. 04 in France is a commandant. Surgeon major could command enlisted people, kind of, but he couldn't command anything outside of a regiment. So the ambulances and the litter bearers were all confined to a regimental role. Letterman says, I want real soldiers trained to do ambulance duty. I want a sergeant in the regiment. I want a lieutenant in the division. I want a captain in the corps. And as a major, I can be responsible for the command and control of those line personnel assigned to this new medical mission. It's the only place in the world that can happen. And McClellan is so worried and so concerned and so responsible that in August he signs off on the ambulance corps. But of course, he's lost the battle. Bobby Lee came out and did better this time. And so most of his army is chopped to General Pope and becomes part of the Army of Virginia and goes to Manassas again and does worse than they did before. This business of losing creates problems. You see, now there was no army between the North and Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And he knows Maryland's a slave state, so he says, I'll go to Maryland and raise those people. And, he wanders up to Frederick. And, well, John Greenleaf Whittier, up from the meadows rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn, the clustered spires of Frederick stand, green-walled by the hills of Maryland. Up rose old Barbara Fritchie then, bowed with her 80 years and 10. She took up the flag the men hauled down, and in her attic window the staff she set, to show that one heart was loyal yet. Shoot if you must, this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. Of course, it never happened. She was sick of bed that day. But it does capture the sense of Frederick. They weren't a slaveholding area. They weren't at all interested in joining the South. And yes, the men dragged down the flag with Stonewall Jackson's cannon pointed at them, but they weren't happy about it. The battles you know, the lost order, McClellan for one time in his life responding promptly to orders and doing what makes sense quickly. Lee reassembled his scattered army after South Mountain along Antietam Creek. And on the 17th of September, we have the bloodiest single day in American history. At South Mountain and then at Antietam, Jonathan Letterman saw and came to understand modern industrial war. And more than that, he understood that his responsibility for his fellow soldiers made him a soldier as well as a doctor. And so, we create the first military medical officer in the mind of Jonathan Letterman between the 14th and 18th of September. Yes, there had been doctors assigned to forces before, but there'd never been one that understood his staff and command role as an officer and had the support to do it. South Mountain was a small action, only 22 hospitals. If you go to Boonesboro, little town, you see the houses, you know why there were 22 hospitals. There's no place is very big. And then the Army moved. The division surgeon goes with the division. There weren't any supernumerary docs to stay with these patients. So Letterman strips out his own staff to care for these patients while the Monocacy River Railroad is reestablished and stuff can come from Washington and Baltimore and Philadelphia. He gets to Antietam. And Antietam's the game changer. Nothing like it before. For the generals, for the doctors. The fight moves back and forth across the field. Assistant surgeons are cut down in fire trying to help people. Staff officers are shot next to their commanders. Their commanders are shot. Supplies have to be trucked out by the civilians and the non-government organizations, the sanitary commissions, Clara Barton, a variety of people, because logistics weren't coming up the railroad the way they ought to be because, well, Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart had interfered with the railroad, and nobody had thought about Plan B. Letterman established 71 hospitals before the battle. They used 120 in the course of the next couple of days. Everybody thought the battle was going to go on, but on the morning of the 18th, Lee was gone. Letterman had the casualties consolidated under a canvas. He'd worked with Britain and knew about the West. Tent hospitals were safer. He began to push supplies so that they weren't lost and abandoned. He began his record management proposals. In October, the general signed off on an expansion of his authority over the placement and the control of medical field positions, moving them back from regiment to division so that the ambulances could find them and be consolidated and build a system. McClellan was, of course, relieved in November, but Burnside, who had commanded the 9th, was part of Pope's army that didn't have an ambulance corps, but Hooker's ambulances came down and collected up Pope's casualties. And he said, this ambulance corps thing's good, so I'll leave Letterman with this stuff. Having your general support you as a staff and specialty officer turns out to be critical. Hooker would give him control over preventive medicine after Fredericksburg, and Meade would help him with sustained strategic evacuation, what we would call Role 3 back to Role 4. Then, at the end of '63, Letterman was relieved at his own request of the load no one had ever carried before. He went to California for light duty. I hope I captured your attention. I believe it was a psychic load that no one had ever carried before. The responsibility as an officer for those fellow soldiers. From South Mountain until he was relieved, I cannot find a case in which Jonathan Letterman was the primary provider for any soldier ever again. Yes, he consulted in the hospital at Pry House. Yes, he consulted in the hospitals at Gettysburg. He wandered by as a hospital commander does, and I'm sure the junior attendings there hoped the old man didn't screw up the care of their patients, just like attendings in America's hospitals do when the general officers wander in. But he realized, probably for the first time, that the health care system was a system of teams. And it was the job of somebody to connect up all those teams, whether it's logistics or evacuation or care. The reason we go to Antietam from America's medical school is because there is where you see military medical leadership created. Peer leadership, working with Hammond, working with Brenton, working with his division surgeons. Senior are led as a staff officer as he convinces these GOs to support this new innovation to meet their responsibilities to care for their patients. And then, of course, down leadership with people like Woodall, who writes after it, he trusted us because we were regulars to do the right thing. He trusted them because he had no choice. All his staff and communications technology was gone, left back at South Mountain. But it inspired those juniors. We teach at USUS that leadership is the enhancement of behaviors, that's actions, cognitions, that's knowledge and beliefs, and motivations, that's reasons, to achieve goals that will benefit the organization. Jonathan Letterman recognized that. Observers saw that. Some of the line officers from Europe comment on it. Nobody's real sure back in Europe they want to take this up. Jay Luvas's classic work from the War College just up the road on the influence of the Civil War on European tactics and stuff. A Navy doctor came by, Ninian Pinckney, sent by SecNav out to see this thing before he went on to the West, and he said, this series of care, I need that. And he asked the Sanitary Commission for a steamer. They renamed the Red Rover, and the evacuation on the Mississippi through echelons of care at Ninian Pinckney's behest through the rest of the Civil War was perhaps some of our first joint doctrine, although the Navy and the Army can't agree that they've ever been joint on anything. By '64, with Letterman in California, Congress decides this is a really good thing and says for the duration of the war, all armies will do it, and of course the war doesn't last much longer anyway. The Army goes off to join John Wayne on the frontier. The medical surgical history is written, and we forget. Edward Dawson didn't forget. He's on the Board of Corrections at Bellevue Hospital. He says, we need an ambulance in the American city. And from Bellevue, the urban ambulance bringing people to the casualty care center in the urban hospital spreads across the country. Because Dawson had been a medical director in the Army of the Potomac. Frederick Esmark read circular number 6. He had been in the Schleswig-Holstein War as a hospital doctor, and he said, this American system of moving people through 3 stages, it makes a lot of sense. And so in '68, in his guidance for young doctors in the next coming war with Austria, he wrote about the importance of moving people from point of care to field dressing station and what you do there, and then on back to definitive care. And he called it the American Plan. In a few years, they would name it the Plan of Letterman. The Japanese would take it over in the Russo-Japanese War. The French would slowly come grudgingly to it, and they would teach it to the AEF in 1917. You mean an American did this? Yes. An American military officer who happened to be a doctor understood that you have to lead up down and sideways. That's why Squire's system didn't happen. That's why Brenton only had a tent. That's why Hammond could give him leave from the rules but couldn't give him a system. You see, leadership is not only recognizing what needs to be done, but motivating people in their actions, their cognitions, their behaviors to do it. That's why we remember Jonathan Letterman. And that's why the museum helps us train enlisted people, graduate nurses, and young physicians every year. We thank you for that, and we urge you to continue to help us remember Jonathan Letterman. Thank you very much.